So welcome everybody and happy International Day of Women and Girls in Science. I'm very, very happy to have all of you here today. My name is Josephine Kefelec. I am Deputy Coordinator for Division 7 Entomology. And I will be welcoming you here today. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live on Robben Huron Treaty Territory. It is a beautiful part of the world that is nested among the Great Lakes, and it is a land on which I live, work, and play, and that belongs to and is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, specifically the Garden River and Batchewana First Nation, as well as the Métis people. And because it is also February, and in Canada and across the United States, we are celebrating the Black History Month. I would also like to wish a happy Black History Month to all our attendees that are celebrating this month. So let me tell you a little bit about IUFRO, which is the organizing or the institution under which we're organizing this webinar this year. It is the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. It is a non-profit, non-governmental global network of forest science cooperation. And it is a union of around 15,000 scientists from 630 member organizations from around 115 different countries. The science in IUFRO is then divided into different divisions, and it is Division 7 Forest Health that is organizing this event. Division 7 is then divided in multiple working parties that you can see here on your screen, and that are grouped into pathology and entomology research groups. So if in the future you would like to get involved in IUFRO, you can visit the IUFRO website. Look for IUFRO units under Science in IUFRO. This will help you identify who is who and to contact office holders. They will then help you participate in IUFRO co-sponsored events like today's event, as well as read and contribute to IUFRO publications, communicate and publish news in IUFRO media, and potentially even, if you want, become an office holder. So I would like to give a big, big thank you to my international team. They have been absolutely fantastic. And all of them have been working very hard for the last 6 months. So thank you very much for all of them for being here today and for organizing this event. So now I will give the floor to Pravina Sharma. She's a resource analyst at Manulife Investment Company in Charlottesville, North Carolina, and she will be your moderator for today. So go ahead, Pravina.
Hello and welcome everyone. It is afternoon here, so I would say good afternoon to everyone. I work currently in Manulife, also known as John Hancock, and it does the timber management in all of the America and some part of Canada. So I would like to introduce our first speaker of this session, who is Dr. Melinda Adams. Melinda is a assistant professor in Department of Geography and Atmospheric Science and Indigenous Studies at University of Kansas. She's also a member of the San Carlos Apache tribe. She has done her Master's of Science from Purdue University and PhD from University of California, Davis. She will be presenting today on the topic of indigenous cultural fire and ancestral environmental solution. Go ahead, Melinda.
Great. Thank you so much, Rabina, and for the organizers for the generous invitation, as well as all of you for registering and attending this wonderful event. I'm so grateful to be in such good company with my fellow panelists, as well as showing some of the efforts that we've made in the realm of Indigenous environmental science. I study fire, so fire geography, fire ecology, and it's being called on now, especially in parts that you mentioned in Canada, the Western United States, in several different areas of the world. So I hope what I have for you is helpful and highlights the roles of our Indigenous women, our matriarchs, who are leaders in the environmental movement and have guided a lot of the scientific research that I've been a part of. So just we say Ashon, many thank yous for having me here and the organizers as well. I study fire again. So what you're looking at is a prescribed fire. It's about 5 acres. So what could be considered smaller in size, but a lot of us within the fire realm are advocating for more responsible fire use to mitigate a lot of the rise in wildfire, gigafire that the world is experiencing now. So I would say as an indigenous person, Dagate, she Melinda Adams, Moshle. Hello, my name is Melinda. I belong to the San Carlos Apache tribe, and they're located in what is now known as Arizona in the United States. And I've worked a lot in California, and now I am home in the Great Plains where my family lives. And yeah, so this is responsible use of fire here. Thank you, Pravina, for sharing I have to skip this slide now. I can skip this slide now, so thank you for sharing some of the places that I've journeyed and picked up education in. I'm more focused, I trained ecologist and environmental scientist, but I've kind of molded into a physical geographer that does human geography and fire geography now. And the research sits at ecology and environmental science. I'm interested in the positive effects that prescribed fire and more specifically indigenous-led slower burns, lower temperature, lower severity prescribed fire. So cultural burns is what it's called, and we're seeing a lot of this work come out of California, of course, but I've also made colleagues with First Nations Canada and some of the areas of British Columbia, and it's now connected me worldwide to First Nations Aboriginal communities in Australia. So very similar stewardship histories of placing fire responsibly for positive ecological, social, and cultural benefits. So I study what happens after fire, all the positive and some potentially negative effects. Policy, because anytime you talk about fire and trying to place fire, it takes a lot of permissions and permits. So the science gets us far, but we also need to work with land tenure is what it's called, private lands, tribal lands, or public lands to be able to move from a fire suppressive agency structure to a more beneficial fire ways of stewarding to mitigate the onset of wildfire, but also the effects of climate change. I ground all of that as best as I can as an Indigenous person, Indigenous scientist in Native American research methodologies, Native American studies pedagogy, storytelling, lived experiences, and really amplifying those traditional ecological knowledges that inform and demonstrate our Indigenous sciences. So that's what cultural burns are, and that's the area of fire research that I work. And just a map, I come from a tribal college. It's one of the 37 universities located in the United States. It was a former boarding school. I think that history is so important when we talk about access to science, what we consider sciences, and for Indigenous peoples, our access to lands and our severance of cultural lifeways that would have otherwise been passed on for generations. So acknowledging the role of colonization within our sciences, within our climate mitigation efforts, but as our also acknowledging our cultural stewarding ways that are being reclaimed. They've been advocated for by our community members, but they're certainly seeing more calls on Indigenous knowledges, traditional ecological knowledge to mitigate a lot of the climatic effects that we're experiencing. This was a slide from 2022, but record-breaking years keep happening. And so what's significant about the work that I do, I worked with numerous tribal nations in what is now known as California, and I like to think of them as fire reclamation leaders. They're the tribes that you see in the news that are reclaiming this ancestral practice of fire stewardship. So my time in California overlapped in the years 2020, 21, and 22, where they experienced the largest extent of wildfire. So this is a picture of the San Francisco skyline, where I was located about 40 miles east of where this was happening. So very meaningful to inform the research, but also the partnerships and the allyships that are built off of trying to solve very big problems and having that lived experience behind it. So in essence, the slide is saying how impactful these wildfires have been, and the calls for more Indigenous knowledges to be integrated into climate mitigation plans. Zeroing in, very much focusing on the work that I was able to do for my doctoral research at UC Davis, looking at the ecological effects of Indigenous-led TEK-informed fire placement, and just the gap in literature that exists right now when we talk about fire science, fire ecology. So this study that I was able to do, but it's more so the experiences and partnerships with tribes there. We looked at the ecological response of slower burns, cultural burns on these 4 plant species here. And I think it's interesting because we monitored a deciduous herbaceous species, a bunch grass, and I'm going in counterclockwise, a wetland reed species, which is an ecological indicator species. So it's interesting to look at the relationship of fire to wetlands. And then a deciduous bush species. And these were pretty heavily prevalent in a lot of the indigenous nations that I worked with in California. So we looked at the regrowth of these 4 different types of plant species. What I focus on, I am trained in some soil science too. I looked at the below ground activity, so the soil nutrient levels and how they shifted with and without fire placement. And we found some pretty interesting results. I'll have to skim by them to get to more material, but nonetheless, our cultural practitioners who informed the research, saw positive effects. The quality of these plant materials were enhanced, and so were the quantity. So we saw more of them grow in better health. So we concluded that fire had a positive effect in the regrowth patterns of these 4 different plant species. There's some pictures of the plants are important, but the cultural materials that they turn into being taken care of, land kept and harvested for cultural use. So this is what you're looking at, just how Indigenous peoples of those lands, the Pultman tribe of California, Southern Wintun, why they place fire to these specific plants and why they're wanting to regenerate them to continue cultural lifeways. So some statewide success that this project and the relationships that formulated it is that there were 2 recent state bills. So the science was informing state bills and assembly bills to leverage more decision-making power and permissions back to Indigenous peoples to be able to place responsible fire in lots of different places in California. For so long, that Indigenous use of fire had been outlawed. It actually wasn't allowed. They weren't allowed to place fire in their own homelands. And then giving the history, which is why I talk about boarding schools, the history of removal and erasure of Indigenous peoples from these lands. So now we're seeing a return of those, not only the Indigenous peoples of those lands, but also their fire stewardship practices be reclaimed in these spaces. So it was neat because the science-informed policy, that connection is so important, particularly for Indigenous peoples. And I'll zip through this, but this is where I work now. Now I'm in the Great Plains, where I teach Indigenous environmental science, pyrogeography, Indigenous research methodologies in this area of the United States considered the Great Plains. And it too has a history of fire usage, fire stewardship by the Indigenous peoples who call these lands home. And again, the graph on the right is showing the same area, but I concentrate on the soils, like the benefits, the positive benefits or I guess the positive effects of prescribed fire, and Indigenous peoples that also fire steward in this part of the world, the positive ecological effects that those present. This is what cultural fire looks like. It looks very different from wildfire, and it looks very different from perhaps a fire agency controlled burn. We have lots of different walks of life out with us, lots of different tribal nations. It's slower, it's cooler. You can see the snow that's present in that snow here, and also with some colleagues in First Nations Canada, it helps lower the intensity of those burns so that we reach optimum ecological benefits in both plant and soil responses. I think that's a key difference, and it's important. And just a couple of papers for me to wrap up here. As a scholar, I write about these things. I write about the ecological benefits. I write about the land tenure restrictions that are placed on my people to be able to exercise their own science or invoke their own sciences on the land. So I write about justice. Indigenous fire justice is a framework that I developed with a colleague of mine that works closely with the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. And just our main takeaways, kind of a hemispheric lens to it, pulling on Indigenous peoples of Guatemala and then Indigenous peoples of Garifuna. So I hope offering us this into the world places fire within a justice lens and how it meets the three main pillars of environmental justice, as you can see on the right. And then I also write about this growing movement of Indigenous data sovereignty, which is the right to access and redistribute data that's taken from Indigenous communities, either by or for Indigenous communities. So I like to think of it as a protective layer of our knowledge, our TEK, of our science. And as this paper puts forth, Indigenous fire knowledge is data and is deserving of those protections and protocols as such. So don't worry if I flash through these, because I have a QR code at the end where you might, if you're interested, check out some of the papers and other scholarship I've written. So just the main takeaways I hope from this talk is that fire, as an Indigenous person, Indigenous scholar, I recognize and amplify that fire belongs in many of our creation stories, prophecy stories, and our land stewardship responsibilities prior to and even through colonization. Myriad landscapes historically were and presently are fire adapted, fire dependent, and more controlled cultural fire builds ecosystem heterogeneity, which is correlated to ecosystem resiliency in the face of those climatic changes that are happening very quickly to our earth and environment. And socially, fire remains in our future. So we have the opportunity in lots of different places in the world to be fire proactive, get good fire on the ground, versus fire reactive, needing to clean up after mass wildfires come through, and working on how we envision fire, taking it from most people's first reaction as a destructive force, a life-taking force, and instead shifting our mindset to perhaps a more decolonized way of thinking about fire, an indigenized way of thinking about it. Fire, we have a relationship with it, and that it has positive benefits when used responsibly. So I will kind of wrap up here. If you're interested in that kind of work, it has ties to both climate change and wildfire mitigation. I also write about climate grief, how our Indigenous peoples in particular, but more so younger folks who are not or are Indigenous or allied, they're experiencing a lot of climate grief, seeing the places that they care about or just seeing mass climate effects more regularly than previous generations. So I write about how being out on the land and placing good fire and seeing the benefits of that fire is a way of mitigating some of that climate grief that our young people in particular are carrying around. I write about decision making and governance that alludes to the land tenure issues that I talked about earlier. I write about women's roles within reclaiming Indigenous fire stewardship practices. I call it remediating fire. And this book is forthcoming. I'm so excited about it. Please add it to your curriculum. If not for me, then all of the other 50 Indigenous authors that are on this critical reflections on traditional ecological knowledge that was edited by a good friend of mine, Laura Jacobs. So there's my contact information. I'm excited to receive questions later, and I'm excited to hear from my colleagues on the remainder of the panel. So with that, I say Oshon, all good things. Thank you so much.
That was a great talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Adams, about it. So I would like to open the floor now for questions, if anyone have, for a few minutes.
Oh, I see one. May go ahead and respond. There's one in the
Yes,
chat.
Pravina, there is a question in the chat. If you could read it for everybody.
Yes. So someone has asked that what is the major cause of fire in Los Angeles?
Yes, thank you, Schneider. Thank you for typing in that question. I hope it's still fresh on everyone's mind, the catastrophic wildfires that took place in Los Angeles on Gabrielino, Tagvana, indigenous homelands. A lot of different reasons led to the fires in Los Angeles, and it's some of the same reasons that you're seeing a lot of wildfire, overgrowth, overbrush. That part of the United States and that part of the world, lots of parts of the world are fire deficient, which means historically they experience a lot of fire, whether it was lightning related, natural fires, or whether if it was indigenous peoples placing fires to these homelands to cut back some of that overbrush that historically grew. Our agencies in California, they are trained in fire suppression. They know how to put wildfire out, but there's not enough resources for them to be fire proactive, to put more fire on the ground. And those burn windows, when it's a good time to burn, with the weather and the atmosphere, those windows are narrowing. So because of climate change, we don't have as big of a window opportunity to get in there and do good burns, and we don't have the resources to place the fire needed to cut back on that overbrush. So that's a long answer for overbrush. Invasive species growth here and anywhere else in the world, they outgrow the way that their rate of energy and growth outcompetes a lot of our native species. So they thrive on disturbance. So that invasive species growth correlates to the amount of fuel that's on that's within, it's called the wildlife urban interface, the WUI. It's where we're starting to build more and more homes to address population issues. So those are overgrowth, invasive species growth, lack of fire stewardship. We're not doing enough good fires, and an increase in heat, increase in temperature, decrease in precipitation, the two main things that drive climate change. Those are some of the reasons why we're seeing catastrophic wildfire, such as Los Angeles. A great question.
Any more questions?
I have a question, if you don't mind, Pravina.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Melinda. That was a beautiful talk. I'm always in awe of your work. So I was wondering, how is this knowledge being transferred? Is it to the whole tribe and everybody comes together when it's time to do the work? Or is it specific people within the tribe that are being given this opportunity to carry that knowledge?
Thank you so much. It's a very beautiful question as well, and really centering like the indigenous knowledge part of what it is that I try to do. And I will say, I work with fire agency people, state agency people, allies, community members. We all have the same goal, and that's to protect the places that we care about, protect the people that live in the places that we care about. So I appreciate you centering the indigenous knowledge portion of your question. Fire looks very different in all of our nations. So I will say we're all different. We might be grouped as indigenous peoples, and even that is an imperfect term. We usually refer to ourselves as the unique tribe and worldview that we come from. So I can give you my answer, but it's going to be different for the next. And I hope you talk to other indigenous, not you, but I hope people on the call talk to other indigenous peoples besides myself. I am not the representative. I'm here to share my experience and the knowledge that I'm grateful to have earned from my community members. But so we're all different, first and foremost, and not a monolith. But in the communities that I work with, we have whole societal structures on who is considered an expert, who's considered an elder with expertise, with knowledge that is gifting those to younger generations. And that's why I amplify indigenous women, because a lot of the environmental decision making or governance structures historically before colonization, they were led by Native women. We call them matriarchal societies. So even with the environmental movement that we experiencing, like Dakota Access Pipeline, Keystone Pipeline, those were led by Indigenous women. Those decisions were made by women, and strong ties to our youth, to very overlooked demographies when it comes to Western science decision or Western decision making. But nonetheless, in each community, those roles are identified through those societal structures. And the way that we try to pass on those knowledge is by getting our youth out there. You wouldn't think to put a 10-year-old out on a fire line that's experiencing fire firsthand, but actually it helps with their being developed state of mind. They don't already have an ingrained fear of fire just yet, whereas an adult already has. So those lessons specifically for fire, but culturally overall, we try to integrate our youth as much as we can. And that's part of the work that I try to do as a scientist when I'm not working with agencies or I'm not working with other university researchers. You know, I try to make as much space as I can for our Indigenous youth, and recognizing that the way that we steward and the way that we pass on those knowledge looks very different, and that we should be carving out those spaces for our community members to learn where they're at, if we're going to build a more Indigenous future. Thank you for that.
Okay, that was a really a lot of Indigenous knowledge, and I also work about that a little bit in our company through the SFI project. So I was really interested to hear some more on that. So thank you so much. I would like to move to our next speaker of the session. She is Leidy Celorio. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So she is the biologist and GIS specialist, and she is a master's student in ecological restoration at the Pontificia University of Javeriana, that is in Colombia. So her research focuses on the conservation of native flora and restoration of ecosystem. Today, she will be presenting on nursery and ecological restoration, integrating communities and knowledge for the conservation of native plants. So I would like to request Leidy to start her presentation.
Hi, Pravina. I'm going to be sharing her video.
Okay.
Just let me know if the sound doesn't work.
Yes, before starting the video, because she is the Spanish speaker, I would like to let everyone in the webinar know that you can write any questions in our chat, and we will translate those questions to her, and we'll translate back to you guys so we can communicate in that way. Thank you. I cannot hear it.
I'm sorry, I tested that earlier and now apparently it doesn't work. What if I do this?
Be able to talk about what I like. Hello, I'm Leidy Celorio, and it's an honor for me to be in this space and to be able to talk about what I like and tell you about some experience that make me happy and that are contributing to take care of the biodiversity of the place where I live. And let's imagine a wetland, a mountain, or a forest that has been degraded, where only trace remain of what was once a vibrant, life-filled ecosystem. And now, imagine that one of the keys to the restoration is in the hands of local communities in small nurseries where hope germinates. Restoration depends on the existence of a species adapted to local ecosystems. In this sense, nurseries are key players because they produce trees, fruits, and herbaceous plants that facilitate the recovery of biodiversity. In addition, they are important because they help to ensure the availability of native plants, conserve endangered species. For example, some nurseries implement programs for the propagation of endangered species, supporting their reintroduction in degraded habitats. They also support the local community by generating economic opportunity and promoting the transfer of traditional and technical knowledge on the sustainable use of biodiversity. It also seeks to facilitate the restoration of areas affected, for example, by the mining or intensive agriculture and other human activities. I live and work in Colombia, a megadiverse country with multiple trended ecosystems, and nurseries play an important role in ecological restoration. Particularly in 2021, governmental restoration goals were proposed, which imply planting millions of trees. And one big surprise was that the demand of trees was very high, and the nurseries didn't know have the production capacity, or we didn't know where to find all the plants to meet these needs. And this led to the consolidation of a nursery network at the national level to know where these nurseries are and the species of ecological importance of restoration. Currently, in the Red de Hidros de Colombia, we have 417 registered nurseries, and we know that they propagate more than 1,000 species of plants. Obviously, in Colombia, they are hundreds of nurseries, but this network try to group those who are interested in ecological process. This network seeks to first promote and participate in successful restoration process, facilitate knowledge exchange between communities, create training space, increase the visibility of local regional nurseries, and contribute to the propagation of more and more native species. And during this process of learning, we have found in the local community an incredible ancestral and cultural knowledge about the species and their uses. I am a biologist. I am in the process of training as a research, and my great teachers now are the communities. For example, the integration of the community in nurseries and restoration is essential. The role of the community in plant production, particularly in community nursing, is crucial as it strengthens local knowledge and increase activity participation in restoration efforts. Restoration is truly successful when people learn and feel engaged in the process. It's also important to combine ancestral knowledge with scientific experience. The people who live in these territories know the plants that existed in the past and understand which species adapt better than others. And additionally, nurses generates employment, strengthen the bioeconomy, and provide alternative livelihood for rural community. We have some challenge. For example, the major problem is the lack of financing or the access to seeds and conflicts of interest and how to address them. Mm, eh, I like to tell you about a short experience. I would like to tell you about one of the process in which I have been working with an excellent team of research from the Alexander von Humboldt Institute involving nurseries and restoration. I invite you to read a little about this beautiful experience that we carried out in the Llano del Yari Yaguarado Indigenous Reserve in the Colombian Amazon. Here, alongside indigenous communities, and we learn about the value of plants, the cultural significance, and how ecological restoration becomes a tool for life transformation. As plants are protagonists, we publish a guide with a total of 27 species of tree, shrubs, and plant present in the region of the Amazon, so that the community can learn to identify them, propagate them, and educate the next generation. It was a beautiful experience. Well, we are celebrating the participation of women in science. I take this space to thank all the women who have taught me about plants, restoration, research, and many other things as professionals and also personally. For me, they are amazing scientists, and I miss that in many more pictures. But to all of them, thank you very much. Of course, thank you, IUFRO, for this opportunity. You are doing an amazing job in sharing knowledge. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations on this wonderful event. Bye-bye.
That was a really nicely put presentation out there that she recorded for us. So I would like to open the floor if anyone has any questions. They can write down in the chat and we can translate that for her.
I have a question for Leidy. Si quieres hablar en español, ¿es posible, Leidy? Hablaste de conflicto de intereses. ¿Puede darnos algunos ejemplos y soluciones que haya implementado?
Bueno, una de las soluciones que hemos dado a estos espacios es integrar a la comunidad, pero enseñándoles que no siempre el dinero está por encima de conservar o restaurar. Es importante tener alternativas económicas pero también es importante fomentar el amor y el cuidado por el entorno en el que vivimos. Otras alternativas que hemos dado es darles una importancia y un uso a las plantas más allá de sembrarlas, sino de intentar encontrar derivados de estas para que ellos también tengan unas alternativas diferentes a las siembras directas. Siempre tratamos de encontrar soluciones adecuadas a las necesidades e implementarlas cuando puedan ser implementadas, porque no en todos los casos podemos ofrecer las mismas alternativas.
Gracias, Leidy.
Josephine, if you don't mind translating your conversation for our audience here.
My Spanish is not good enough. That was too quick. I got just enough for myself. But we'll do our best to put translation on the YouTube video. Yeah.
Okay. Someone is saying, oh, Gina is saying she can help on the chat. So Gina, if you can translate their conversation a little bit for our participants here. Maybe we need to unmute her. Okay.
Yes, it was really difficult. Sorry. I guess with all the difficulties that we had in session one this morning, that's it was a recommendation to just have the muted microphone. So, Leidy, it was a really great presentation. I will do my best to translate part of your answer. So if I miss some of the information, of course, with the captions, we can help. So she was saying first that the work with the communities is extremely important as as they also explain like the value of the conservation that is not only related to the money, and that's where the conflict relies, but it's also the value that the communities will have long term with the value of the conservation. So in areas in areas where you will have plants that are in need or plants that you need to protect, of course, in the long term, is more important to preserve those plants than actually gain something out of money for those communities that are in an active space. She was also referring that in some spaces, the solutions are organized and are crafted according to all those communities and, of course, according to the land and everything. Like the value is related with, of course, with the love of the community for nature and for the spaces where they live, basically. So I hope I have covered broadly part of it. But yes, if you have more additions, please write it, and then we will do our best also to help.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. And
Gracias.
yeah, I hope that was helpful for everyone here listening to this. So we have two more speakers left for our session two. Our next speaker is Emma Briggs. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So Emma is a first-year doctoral student in Dr. Kamal Gandhi's forest entomology lab, and they are investigating the role of streamside management zones as habitat refugia for flower visiting bee and stinging wasp community in southeastern working pine forest. So today, she would be presenting us about her work in detail. Floor is to you, Emma.
Thank you, Prabina, and thank you for IUFRO for inviting me to this wonderful event today. We're going to switch gears with my talk a little bit and talk about some forest entomology in the southeastern United States. So, like Prabina said, I'm a first-year doctoral student in Dr. Kamal Gandhi's Forest Entomology Lab at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, in the United States. And I'm going to be talking about bee and wasp diversity responses to streamside management zones in private working pine forests. So to start off, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on my project. As many of you guys know, the southern United States is often called the wood basket of the world due to its abundance of planted pine forests. We have right around 39 million hectares of these managed forests in the region, and they make up about 20% of the total land area in Georgia, the state where my research takes place. So it's a big component of the landscape. So given the huge scale of southern forestry, voluntary conservation guidelines known as Forestry Best Management Practices, or BMPs, were first developed in the 1960s to help protect water quality within these working pine forests. So these forestry best management practices included the creation of streamside management zones, or SMZs. SMZs are vegetated riparian buffers that will surround perennial or intermittent streams in these forests. And they help to prevent soil erosion and to reduce non-point source pollution during forestry operations. And in addition to improving water quality, these buffers will provide a mature mixed pine hardwood forest component on the landscape that might be beneficial for certain species that are adapted to that forest type. So the rationale for my project is that there's been really limited research on lower trophic level biodiversity, so plants and insects, things like that, within these SMZs, despite the potential floral and nesting resources available in these mixed pine hardwood forests. So research is needed to characterize wild bee and stinging wasp communities within these SMZs to better understand how these areas are contributing to overall biodiversity within private working pine forests of the southeastern United States. So I wanted to give a brief introduction to wild bees to the non-entomologists out there. As you can see in the photo in the bottom right, they're an incredibly biodiverse group with around 20,000 species found globally, and over 500 just in the state of Georgia, where I work. Around 90% of all flowering plants benefit from insect pollination, and wild bees are specifically important since they provide anywhere from 20 to 50% of our crop pollination services. Unfortunately, though, there is some evidence that certain populations are experiencing global declines, and scientists think that these declines are likely related to anthropogenic factors. So things like pesticide exposure, especially from neonicotinoids in agricultural areas, habitat loss and change, introduced diseases, especially from non-native honeybee colonies. Apis mellifera, the western honeybee, is actually not native to North America. So there can be some disease transference between those colonies and wild bee communities. And then finally, climate change. So with these declines, there's been a big push to expand wild bee conservation research outside of just agricultural areas. And this includes both urban environments as well as our managed forests. We've also chosen to include stinging wasps in this study, which includes all of our non-parasitoid aculeate wasp species. You can see some examples of common families in North America on the right there. So these wasps can either be solitary or social. They are not parasitoids, and they are incredibly biodiverse, with around 33,000 species found globally. So on top of being such a biodiverse group, they're also important because many species are both nectarivorous and carnivorous, meaning that they visit flowers and can provide some pollination services, as well as preying on other insects and providing some natural pest regulation services. I feel like wasps are often overlooked by the public and even other entomologists in comparison to more popular pollinators like bees, but they're an important component of biodiversity at these sites, and they are also impacted by anthropogenic stressors, so things like agricultural chemicals and habitat loss, and they'll definitely benefit from sustainable forest management practices as well. So the two main research objectives for my dissertation are to characterize wild bee and stinging wasp communities within SMZs and adjacent pine stands in the southeastern plains ecoregion, And then to relate our hymenopteran diversity metrics with environmental and structural features of these SMZs. So things like stream width, basal area, and the vegetation composition within these areas. So moving on to my methods, this summer we selected 12 SMZs within the southeastern plains ecoregion of Georgia that were adjacent to pine stands of varying different stand stages. So this summer, our pine stands ranged from less than 2 years old to over 20 years old. And we required each of our SMZs to have similar age pine stands on either side of them. And you can see the map of my counties where my sites were located in the state of Georgia there. So for insect sampling, within each of our SMZs, we trapped insects for a week each month from April to August of 2024. So we tried to capture a wide flight season. And we used 2 trap types that are pretty common in pollinator sampling studies. The first is blue vein traps, which is that image on the left, and then blue, yellow, and white pan traps, and that image is of a yellow pan trap in the middle there. So basically, these traps function by being super brightly colored, and they will trick the bee or the wasp into thinking that the plastic trap is a flower. So they will fly in, go inside the trap, and then they can be captured for future species identifications. And we had 6 of these trapping stations set up in each of our stands, 3 stations in the SMZ, and then 3 stations within the adjacent pine stand. We also measured stand attributes around each of our trapping stations, and there's an image of us taking a DBH on a very large oak tree in one of the SMZs. So this included recording all of the tree species present within a 10-meter radius of our trapping station, as well as their DBH, and the number of snags and logs present within that area, which can actually be really important for hymenopteran species that nest in deadwood. And we also recorded percent canopy openness, which can be a good indicator of the amount of floral resources that are going to be available. We also did a little bit of a finer scale vegetation sampling using 1 square meter quadrats. So we had 4 of these quadrats around each trapping station and recorded understory plant cover of each of the plant species within the quadrat, as well as the percent cover of litter fall, woody debris, bare ground, and the number of hollow stems. We did choose to group all of our graminoid species as grasses for this study. Graminoids are typically pollinated by the wind and provide fewer resources for flower visiting insects. And if anyone has had to ID graminoids to species level in the field, you know it can be quite difficult. But we did just finish up our insect identifications a few weeks ago, and we can now share some preliminary results with you. So in our SMZs, we captured 553 bees from 37 species. Notable finds include the water lily sweat bee, which is a wetland obligate species that had not been previously recorded in a working forest before. So Lasioglossum nilumbonis, that is the top image there. We also found the woolly oil digger bee, Centris linosa, that's that middle bee. And I'm really excited about this one because it is a new state record for Georgia. It is a pretty common bee in more western United States, so in Texas, Mississippi, some of that area. And there's a very small kind of disjointed population in Florida, but nobody had found it in Georgia before. We also captured 140 wasps from 28 species, including Euphuta poxilla, which is a predatory velvet ant species. This group is called velvet ants, but they are actually flightless wasps, typically. In comparison to our adjacent pine stands, we captured over 1,000 bees from 59 species. So definitely a lot more bees in the pine stands and a higher species richness, but we think that this richness is likely related to that mix of pine stand stages that we had in our project. We suspect that the younger clear-cut stands that were included are likely supporting that higher bee abundance and richness, just due to the open canopy conditions that are going to support more floral resources. Surprisingly, this trend of higher richness did not continue with our wasps, which had 139 captures from 24 species, which was pretty similar to what we found in the SMZs. But overall, our results indicate that SMZs are supporting a distinct portion of the pollinator community and are likely providing either important floral or nesting resources for some segments of the wild bee and stinging wasp community. All right. So now that we have all of this data, our next steps are going to be to conduct multivariate analysis and analysis of variance tests to compare the bee and wasp communities between our SMZ and pine sampling plots. And we're also hoping to do a functional trait analysis. So this will include correlating life history traits of our insects. So things like diet, body size, flight season, nesting substrate, and correlating with various stand attributes that we're finding in our forests. We are continuing the study next summer, so you'll have to stay tuned. But this time we are selecting SMZs in the southern coastal plain ecoregion of Georgia, so about 2 hours south of where we were last summer. And we are going to plan to incorporate a new trapping system that's going to target cavity nesting hymenopteran species. So here's a diagram that we took from another paper that has similar methods. And you can see that these traps basically are just a container that clusters hollow stems and reeds. So a bee or a wasp will fly in and use those reeds as kind of an artificial nesting system. And so we can install these trap nests at the beginning of the field season and then collect them at the end, and we'll be able to see who is actively nesting in our stands. We're also planning to do some DNA metabarcoding analysis on any pollen provisions that are left by bees in these trap nests. So hopefully we can actually identify some of the most important forage plant species for our wild bee communities. I'm particularly excited for this aspect of the project since there's been really little research on pollinator communities within forest canopies, even though there's been quite a bit of evidence that certain bee species can take advantage of canopy resources. Particularly hardwood tree species in the southeastern United States will often flower early in the flight season of these species before there's abundant floral resources available in the understory. So when we sample just exclusively in the understory, we might be missing a big component of our bee and wasp biodiversity. All right, with that, I'd like to acknowledge my funding sources for my PhD project, Weyerhaeuser and Causey and the Warnell School, as well as my wonderful lab mates and technicians that have helped me in these pine stands that can get a little gnarly. And also identification help from Sam Droege and Rick Hobeck at the UGA Insect Museum have been critical for my species identifications. And with that, I can take any questions that people have.
Thank you, Emma. That was a really great presentation and more interesting to me because my master's research was on bee as well.
I knew you worked on pollinators. Yeah.
Yes. I can see question in the chat from Pascal Frey, and the question is like, what are your hypotheses about the higher number of bee species in pine stands compared to SMZ?
So we were a little surprised to see this, but I expect the higher richness is probably stemming from the fact that we have a wide variety of age ranges in our adjacent pine stands. So young, clear-cut pine stands we know support a wide variety of bee species just because they're recently opened. The understory plant communities are responding to that disturbance. So there's usually a lot of pollen and nectar resources available. But I was surprised to see that we're finding very distinct communities in the SMZ in comparison to the pine stands. So my personal thinking is that our SMZs are likely providing certain nesting resources that are going to be beneficial for our deadwood nesting species, species that nest in the ground and require certain soil types. So they might be foraging in those pine stands, but then coming back in the SMZs and nesting, which is why we're incorporating this trap nest study this next year to see how the bee and wasp communities are actually utilizing these SMZs. Thank you for your question.
Okay, so anyone have more questions? So there is a question from Gina. She's asking, did you find any invasive pollinators too?
Unfortunately. So We found one invasive megachile species, which is the giant resin bee that actually comes from Asia. And we also found quite a few honeybees. I know that's a touchy topic on whether people consider them to be an introduced species or not, but they are not native to our ecosystem here in the southern United States. So we did remove honeybees from our analysis just because they are a managed pollinator. But for the most part, only one true invasive species, the giant resin bee.
Okay. Sarah is saying thank you for your presentation. I have one more question from myself.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, are you guys like considering any time of the day or like season of the year to be like when you are investigating different stands, then there can be different time frame which
Mhm.
might causes like a difference in this number of the bees. So
Yes. So we're trapping from April to August this last summer, and we're gonna try to get out even earlier this year, so March to August. Just because bees are definitely specialized in their flight season. They have those really distinct evolutionary relationships with their host plants. So they will typically only come out for a brief period, usually about a month to 6 weeks. And so by trapping throughout the season, we're hopefully going to capture a lot of that variation. Unfortunately, we didn't do any active sampling for this project just because it's kind of difficult in these forest systems when there's not distinct patches of flowers where you can visit and capture bees. So we used passive trapping systems that are going to be trapping consistently throughout a week period. So hopefully that will negate some of the variation just in time of day. For our Centris lanosa, the new state record that we found, we're actually going to go back to the site we found it at this year and try to do some active netting in order to figure out what they're using here because it's a novel population that hasn't been studied before.
yeah, that's an interesting find. I was also interested, did you guys found anything in that blue vein trap? Because when I was doing my research, we did not trap a single species bee in the blue vein trap, which was interesting.
That's very interesting. Yeah, our blue vein traps are our most productive traps, surprisingly, in this study. Typically, blue vein traps are going to be very useful for large-bodied pollinators, so we get a lot of bumblebees, some longhorn bees as well. And then the pan traps, we've really only been finding some wasp species and some very small-bodied halictids, so things like lasioblossom and halictus. But yeah, that's interesting. Where were you in your trapping?
I was doing in South Carolina.
Were you in like forests or orchards or?
Like a urban forest ecosystem, not like the forest, but yeah,
Mm.
it was interesting.
Just it goes to show bee communities are variable depending on where you
Yes.
go.
Right. Okay, thank you, Emma. Considering our time limit, I would like to move forward with our, if no one has question, with our last presenter of the day. Let me see. So she is Natalie Mesa, if I'm pronouncing that right. She is Natalie Mesa Sierra. So she would be, hold on, where did that go? Okay. She would be presenting on our role as a female guardians of tropical dry forest today. Natalia is a Colombian biologist with a master's and doctorate from Institute of Ecology in Mexico. So today she is a full-time academic at ITESO Mexico, and she is really contributing to ecological restoration effort as well as working with the transdisciplinary teams to achieve social and ecological changes. That is really great. So I would like to leave the floor for her and start her presentation.
Can you see my presentation?
Hold on. Yes.
Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Today, I'm going to share with you, as Robina said, I'm Natalia Mesa Sierra, and today I'm going to share with you a part of my career as a scientist, which is related to our role as female guardians of tropical dry forest. So to start, tropical dry forest is an ecosystem that is globally distributed, and through its distribution, it has a lot of variation in its vegetation physiognomy, in its species composition, but there are like a couple of characteristics that group all these type of tropical dry forest. The first one is the very delimited season, drought season, which is between 3 to 8 months of drought in the year. Also, it's deciduous vegetation, which is that through the drought season, the trees lose their leaves. And also, this type of ecosystem, it has a high number of endemic species. Despite of being this very diverse and incredible ecosystem, it's also one of the most threatened terrestrial ecosystems worldwide. For example, in Mexico, here I'm showing you the distribution of this ecosystem through the country. And here you can see an ecological degradation index. So we can see that through its distribution in Mexico, this ecosystem has very high ecological degradation. And this is just like a picture of what we are finding. We are finding in globally, right, through this ecosystem distribution. In theory, we are in the decade on ecosystem restoration till 2030, right? However, it's very conflicting that, sorry, in COP26, world leaders promise to end deforestation by 2030. So on one hand, we have the restoration decade, but on the other, we have like permission to destroy our ecosystems. So we are in the same decade. In the Living Planet report for 2020, it was found that we had been lost around 68% of our biodiversity. And that the only way to reverse, to change that current trend was two ways, not only one, but two ways. And it's first, we have to strengthen the conservation efforts, but this must work also with the restoration initiatives. So we need to focus in these two strategies, conservation and restoration. And this is also reflect on the fact that we have initiatives globally, not only the restoration decade, but for example, in Latin America, we have the Initiative 2020, which seeks to have a very ambitious restoration goal. For example, in Mexico, this initiative was signed on 2014. Sorry. And for example, in Mexico, Mexico committed to restore 8.5 million hectares by 2030. And I can tell you that Mexico is far, far away from that goal. So we have like very ambitious goals on one side, but we also have like very important pressure on our ecosystems. So trying to understand the vulnerability of this ecosystem, we have been trying to understand its conservation status, but also how we have been trying to restore tropical dry forest. So we found that worldwide, the two main land uses that destroy this ecosystem are cattle and crops, right? And we also found out, that pattern regionally. So for Mexico, we also found that crops and cattle are the land uses that are destroying tropical dry forest. So focusing on these two land uses, we must say that our food production are destroying tropical dry forests. Even if we go to a local scale, we have this study in the state of Veracruz in Mexico, and we can orange and yellow, it's crops and cattle. So we can see this pattern of land uses locally, regionally, and globally, right? And what happened in terms of ecosystem services, because we are not only losing the cover of this ecosystem, but we are also losing its ecosystem services. So, for example, in this study where we analyze different ecosystem services in Veracruz, if you remember the previous map, in those sections of orange and yellow, which were crops and cattle, we don't have these ecosystem services from tropical dry forest. So we are facing not only biodiversity loss, but we are facing ecosystem services lost. And this lead us to the fact that we must rethink our landscapes. We must rethink the way we manage our landscapes, and we need to make change in the production practices, right? Because if these are the main causes, because we are losing our ecosystems, especially tropical dry forest, we need to rethink our landscapes and rethink how to incorporate more sustainable ways to produce our food. So in these terms, we analyze where the tropical dry forest restoration is occurring. And we have two contrasting scenarios. In Latin America, it's more common to have like more number of studies regarding restoration, but with very small restored areas. We have very small funds for restoration. Contrasting with scenarios in Africa, for example, where we have large restored areas with a few studies, but we are facing like these contrasting scenarios. So we've been trying to work with people and to understand how local communities are facing the challenges of losing ecosystems and ecosystem services. And we've been working on a region here in Mexico named Bahía de Banderas in the state of Nayarit. And we've been trying to understand all these consequences and trying to plan their different landscapes, right? And after this type of exercises, we've always been asking what happens next, who is going to get involved in what needs to be done, because we have very clear ideas of what we need to do to make the changes we need to make. We need to rethink our landscapes, and we need to have these nature-based solutions, right? In order to have like human well-being and biodiversity benefits. In terms of restoration, plantings are like the most used strategy to restore tropical dry forests. It's also a strategy that has like a high commitment, social commitment. People usually get very easily involved with plantings. But we have two scenarios, and this is where our female role comes. When you try to seek for help with women, you will get a very easy answer from them. They will get committed and involved very easily. Contrasting when you try to say to men like, okay, it's time to take action, and the response, it's usually very poor. And it's very conflicting because we are more vulnerable to climate change, right? And we have a lot of numbers and a lot of information of how we are more vulnerable to climate change. And it's not only that we are vulnerable, but we have fewer rights over land. So the women who work the land compared to the total people that work the land in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's less than 35% in the best cases. So we don't have land rights. We don't have we're not allowed to work the land, but we are more vulnerable to climate change. So this makes us that we are more conscious and more aware of the changes that we need to make. And it was in this project that we've been working in the state of Nayarit, that we've been trying to work on restoration and changes of practices on food production. Our best allies have been women. So this is the potential that we have as female role and female protectors of our ecosystems, also involving new generations in order to make the changes not only in the moment, but in the time and in future generations. And just as final thoughts, I would like to add that we must seek collaboration in order to avoid redundant efforts in what we are trying to do. Nature-based solutions must be the answer to transition for food production systems. The recovery of ecosystem services is the only way we might find to mitigate and adapt to climate change. It is important, and it must be like non-negotiable, the incorporation of social strategies with gender perspectives. And finally, we need to build a future in which women have more land rights. And thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. It was a very great presentation, especially about the role of women and how that is definitely true that women are more vulnerable with the climate change and we are more responsible too. I completely agree with that. With that, ends our presentation for session 2 today. And if anyone have a question for her, you can write it on the chat. And next we are gonna do an open discussion. So if you have any other questions in general for any of our speakers or any one of us that you want to talk about, then you can write it down on the Q&A or the chat session as well. First, I will take the questions for Natalia, if anyone has any.
I have a question, Ravina. Thanks, Natalia, for your presentation. It was fascinating. I wanted to know, so you mentioned that cattle and food production or agriculture, I guess, is contributing the most to land use change. Do you know maybe the contribution of food produced for export against food produced for consumption locally by communities?
No, and I've been trying to research that information. At least here in Mexico, it's very difficult because we don't have like the traceability of the food chain for the whole food chain. So we don't have like the information of the impact of how far the food is going. So it's very, very difficult to trace that.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering that because I believe from past research or reading that I did, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a feeling that women would be more responsible for land that is used for their own household and communities. But then when it comes to like commercial food production, maybe men might be more responsible because they're landowners. And so is there a limit to how much women can contribute if they are not owners and responsible for that land?
Yes, definitely. And it's a fact that the inequality that we are facing on the land rights, it's also on, as you mentioned, on how much we are allowed to work the land. And yes, for example, here in Mexico, there is a government program that only landowners can get to participate in this program. So mainly men are participating. However, the program is focused on the production of fruit, tree fruit, right? And men are getting into the program, but they have to work other lands. So the ones that are working that lands are women, but they are not. But the women are not getting the payment for participating in that program. So there are a lot of inequalities due to land rights.
So there is one question in the chat from Lisa. So she is asking, can you specify again in which way we as a women are more vulnerable to the climate change? She's saying she missed that a bit and she would really like to know for the future. And she's saying super interesting presentation.
Thank you. Yes, so there are different ways where we are more vulnerable. For example, women are less like funds to respond to climate disasters and climate or even adaptive technologies. Some of them are focused on landowners again. So men are the beneficiaries, the direct beneficiaries of that funds. Also, for example, for women that stayed at home, like to take care of kids, or so if home it's you don't have water because of droughts, or for example, if there is too much heat and you are the one staying at home, you are the one responsible for resolving and solving like all these issues by your own. So that are like some examples. Also, there are some indicators like 80% of the people that are displaced because of climate change are women. And yes, that are some of the examples that comes to my mind right now.
Okay, thank you. I feel like as far as I understand, that is because women has more cultural responsibility and all that. So we are kind of like a target, but we are not getting the equal opportunities like men to do these stuffs. Okay, so there is one more question from Pascal Frey. So the question is a comment to Josephine, her question. So typical example of land use change in Mexico is deforestation for planting avocado trees, much of avocado production being sent to the USA. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, I think that we also need to add another variable, which is violence, because avocado crops currently are very related to illegal groups with like narco traffic activities, and it's also a main violence, right? And we are more vulnerable in also in different ways.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for answering our questions. So now I would like to open the floor for open discussion. So if anyone has any questions regarded to the topic earlier discussed in this presentation, or any topic outside the presentation, you are welcome to write it down in the chat at this point. I can see in our Q&A session there was a question earlier about as a women forester, do we have any type of opportunities we can avail on the international level? And Melinda has answered the question, I guess. So, if you want to let people know a little bit more about that.
Sure, Pravina, thank you. I would love to further elaborate. If the person is still here, I appreciate that. And I will say what brought me to this work with fire stewardship and being an Indigenous woman and doing this work both in a science field and then in the wildfire space. Women in general, regardless of age or race, were severely underrepresented in the wildfire management roles and people that are doing the everyday operations. Just as wildfire goes, very underrepresented in terms of women, and then from there, women of color, younger women or older women. So just first and foremost, so the opportunities that this person might be asking about, both here in the United States, we have the United States Forest Service, which is under the umbrella of the Department of the Interior for now, as a government agency that's works in partnership with fire agencies to address wildfire or any kind of fire ecology work that's being done on public lands and federal lands. So I have a hint that's why they're asking about leadership opportunities as a forester. And so having said all of that, I did put a link in the chat with TREX events, which are emerging leadership trainings that takes you to all different parts of the world. So first of all, the TREX is worldwide. The last international TREX was in Africa. The next one will be in Australia. And most recently, we had the first Indigenous Women's Training Exchange, TREX, for fire agencies, for allies, for Indigenous peoples that may or may not have fire certifications, which are federally required. So the very first one was in Northern California that was led by the Hupa and Yurok tribes, which are world leaders in fire stewardship. So I hope that's helpful. I hope you pass that on to your circles, and for everyone that's interested in fire on the call, those are open opportunities for both foresters, wildfire agencies, as well as people that want to learn and more hands-on fire experiences.
Okay, awesome. That is great. Okay, I would like to thank everyone for attending our session today. We are well ahead of our time, I would say. So that is great and that is awesome. And I would like to thank our speakers who presented really nice, awesome work in the field of forestry. And it is really great to see all the women professional working and coming together in the meeting like this is kind of motivating and inspiring to the younger generations. So I would really appreciate everyone for that. And also before leaving, I would like to say that we do this meeting every year on the Women's Day, like this, like International Women's Day. So next year around the same time, we will have this meeting. So if anyone is interested, be in a lookout for the email from our IUFRO division, and you can follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter or any other social media to be updated about it. And I would like to say, if Josephine, if you have any final ending comments on this,
I think you did great. I think that's a great way to close the meeting. And thank you so much for everybody, for our speakers, and for everyone for attending.